Hello, I'm Charlie Smith, Reader in Creative Pedagogies in the School of Art and Design at Liverpool John Moores University, where I teach on the undergraduate and postgraduate architecture programmes. This presentation discusses the impact of the transition from studio-based encounters to virtual learning on a pedagogy that revolves around dialogic interaction, the dynamics of which arguably become distinctly different online. For example, Iran Manesh and Onenote posit that the transition of the design studio from physical place to virtual space raises a number of issues because of its intrinsic socio-spatial character. The process and outcomes of design studio work are extensively communicated through visual means. However, notwithstanding these tangible manifestations of learning, architectural education strongly aligns with socio-constructivist pedagogy, in which discourse is a primary tool for cognitive development, and learning is co-constructed through interaction, negotiation, and collaboration between students and tutors, and between students and their peers. Through a combination of reflection on teaching practices and the research literature, I'm going to be exploring the effects on a variety of signature elements of architectural teaching through which dialogic learning occurs. For example, an integral feature of the design review lies in the event itself. Can this be effectively replicated in a virtual format? Similarly, informal peer discussion and studio culture are often considered fundamental, if tacit, elements of learning in creative disciplines. How do these occur effectively in a virtual space? Moving forward, it's likely that some institutions will seek to retain elements of virtual teaching alongside face-to-face through a so-called blended learning approach. Furthermore, upon return to face-to-face teaching after a prolonged hiatus, some students will have very little experience of studio culture. The presentation concludes by discussing some of the potential consequences and opportunities this will present. Vygotsky describes how speech and social context are an essential part of cognitive development, and that the internalization of socially rooted activities is a distinguishing feature of human psychology, where higher functions originate as interactions between individuals, and learning presupposes a specific social nature. He would argue that Amina and Assal's description really captures the essence of learning within the design studio. Packer and Gocochea observe that learning is an integral part of broader ontological changes that stem from participation in a community, and that as individuals strive to come to terms with their community of practice, they take a stand on the way that that community of practice has positioned them, which in turn acts on and shapes that community itself. Although criticised by Webster for its didactic and tutor-centred nature, we may still recall Donald Schon's account of the dialogue between Quist and Petra, which exemplifies some aspects of the dialogic quality of teaching within the design studio. However, Mewburn proposes that design learning centres on conversations between numerous actors, tutors, students, and their peers, through which participants are enculturated into a community of practice. As such, studio pedagogy aligns strongly with a socio-constructivist approach to learning, in which students and tutors are involved in a social process of collaborative interaction through loops of dialogue. The significance of these dialogic interchanges can be seen in their affective dimension. Austerlitz and Aravot propose that students' emotional responses to these conversations are some of the most important instruments through which they evaluate their studio encounters and interpret meaning from dialogue with their tutors, and these therefore exert significant influence on students' learning. The dynamics of dialogic interaction, even around visual media, are arguably distinctly different when they occur in virtual space as opposed to a physical place. In face-to-face conversation, body language and facial expressions can have a significant impact on how information is interpreted. Arguably, however, when conducted through a screen, these aspects of language and expression become filtered and some nuances of the dialogue are lost. Using recent findings in neuroscience research, Riva, Weiderhold and Mantovani argue that as participants cannot simultaneously look into the camera and at the faces on the screen, the impossibility of eye contact and exchange of glances reduces group engagement, collaborative performance, and creativity. They describe how the experience and development of identity and self are both collectively and individually anchored in the relationship to places, and argue that virtual spaces do not activate the binding experiences constructed through autobiographical memory. The resulting experience of placelessness created by virtual learning spaces weakens an individual's sense of professional self-concept. This suggests a different learning experience occurs when it takes place in a virtual space, as opposed to the design studio or the lecture room. Furthermore, for many valid reasons, students can be reluctant to turn their webcams on. However, when this happens, even that filtered sense of facial expression and body language is completely absent, and the key elements of effective dialogue and communication are rendered absent. During the pandemic at LJMU, Zoom was integrated into Canvas, the university's virtual learning environment. This meant online teaching over Zoom could be scheduled and accessed through the VLE. Each design tutor would create a Zoom meeting for their weekly tutorials with their group. Students could attend for a whole or half a day and see the work of their colleagues, as well as their own half-hour formative discussion with their design tutor. Design reviews were conducted in a similar format, but with a different design tutor from the same cohort and a guest critic from professional practice. This is my own working space, with the Wacom drawing tablet I used during these tutorials. Across the undergraduate and postgraduate programs, a Microsoft OneNote classbook was created for each tutorial group. These class notebooks have a subsection for each student within the tutorial group, in which there are tabs that can be designated for tutorials and reviews. Under each tab, a separate page could be created for that week's teaching session. The class notebook enables the tutor to access the work of all their students, but each student can only see their own work. Any material the tutor wants to share with all students in the group, such as a relevant precedent or site information, can be uploaded to a shared subsection called the collaboration space. Students uploaded their formative work each week in the form of PDF drawings and JPEG photographs of models. The design tutor would then share their screen during the Zoom tutorial session. Using OneNote meant the tutor could annotate and sketch over the student's work during the online tutorials. At the end of each session, the student retained access to the annotated drawings and images as they continued working during self-directed study time. Additionally, the class notebook could be shared with other tutors. This meant it could be used for students to upload their work for design reviews, keeping all of their development work in one location online. In a research study on architecture students' preferences in their feedback experience, they described wanting more visual feedback, such as tutor sketches, diagrams, images, and tutors marking up their drawings. OneNote facilitated this very effectively, as students retained a collection of annotations and sketches from each and every tutorial and review. Indeed, the students commented how effective it was to be able to go back to earlier conversations in both tutorials and reviews. It could be speculated that in these screened and filtered conversations taking place online, the drawn component of tutorials and reviews plays a much more significant role. Easy access to search engines also facilitated discussion around precedents during the tutorials. In contrast to these digital drawings, the BA Architecture Programme leader at JMU, Jamie Scott, experimented with techniques to encourage first-year students to engage with physical hand drawing during their design development work. This is a key skill at the start of the undergraduate course. Using two webcams simultaneously, Jamie used screen share in Zoom to show the image captured by a webcam fixed to an angle-poised stand set over his sketchbook. At the same time, he maintained virtual face-to-face contact during the Zoom using the Zoom sidebar in Zoom and his webcam laptop for face capture. The direct nature of the webcam over his sketchbook enabled him to give a clear demonstration of physical sketching whilst discussing the students' project work and reinforcing some key principles at first year level, where drawing by hand in design journals and drawing boards is strongly encouraged. Jamie reported this was an engaging way to conduct tutorials and that looking at real paper gave his own eyes a change from continuously focusing on a screen. The design review is a cornerstone in studio pedagogy. An integral feature lies in the event itself, an exhibition and verbal presentation of work for formative and summative discursive feedback. In studio, its format as an exhibition of work on the wall, with each student standing before their project to present it to a panel of tutors, guest critics and peers, contrasts significantly with that of a tutorial, where work is typically discussed at a table, often on a one-to-one basis. This makes it a distinctive event within studio culture. The nature of the event provides impetus and motivation to students as they prepare for key milestones in the evolution of their design project. However, when taking place in a virtual space, it becomes very similar to the format of a tutorial. The sole differences being that a different tutor and guest critic are included in the Zoom meeting. Arguably as such, the gravity and significance of the event is significantly diminished, making it more akin to a large tutorial. Consequently, a key element of studio design teaching is lost in the transition to online learning. Manesh and Onenote reported online design reviews were perceived by students as slightly better than their counterpart in physical studio. The authors speculate this may be because the students had more control over what was being presented, as opposed to having all their work on display, enabling them to focus on their project strengths. They also suggest the hierarchical structure of virtual reviews is different from that which occurs when they take place in the physical studio, which might foster a more significant sense of empowerment for the students. Anecdotal feedback from JMU students about virtual design reviews was rather mixed. One described it as easier to see the work being presented, giving them confidence their work was being shown in the clearest way, and feeling equally motivated afterwards as they did in physical reviews. Another student described it as being difficult to effectively present their work online due to the disruptive process of scrolling, also as lacking the evidence of process that physical sketchbooks provide, and they described feedback as less personal and lacking in quality compared to that received in studio. Others described the dialogic interaction as more of a conversation with the reviewers, and consequently more relaxed and less intense than studio reviews. They speculated that whilst this might benefit less confident students, it may also hinder the development of essential presentation skills. McLean and Hourigan found that socially based interaction between students plays a central contribution to the overall quality of studio-based learning, and is both complementary to, but quite distinct from, learning derived through interaction with their tutors. In socio-constructivist pedagogy, interaction and dialogue are key features of how learning is co-constructed. This raises the question of what impact the transition to online learning has made, where the social context is considerably different. When comparing architecture students' experiences of the virtual studio with its physical counterpart, Manesh and Onenote found that while students reported an increase in conducting self-directed research and acquiring new skills, there was a significant decline in informal peer learning among students. They also found the majority of students considered virtual tutorials did not substitute face-to-face interaction with their tutor, and that not being able to have face-to-face contact made their design studio experience much worse. Yoon and Lean described concern over how teaching and interaction styles are restricted when they move online, due to increased instructional unilateralism and interaction limitations. But they suggest that as the level of social presence perceived by learners in video conferencing increases, it is expected that social learning activities will be more widely used and will make positive contributions to learning performance. Their study demonstrated that a high level of social presence has a positive effect on group cohesion, and that both these factors in turn have a positive effect on group efficacy and academic performance. Their results highlight the importance of social presence to assist group performance in virtual conference formats such as Zoom. Recognising that barriers to online design education relate to interaction and the social environment, WAG argues that when translating design education to an online environment, the social aspect of Studio cannot be left to evolve by chance, but requires the engineering of a social environment conducive to experiential learning. She describes how in the development of an online design programme, a key priority was to create social activities at the beginning of teaching sessions. These were designed to engage students and stimulate reflective conversations to establish a community of practice and sense of belonging. And encouraging student engagement during the first weeks was critical in establishing expectations for online behaviour. A strategy used to nurture informal interactions in the architecture programmes at JMU was to create breakout rooms in the weekly Zoom tutorials. The idea was that during the tutorial day, students could observe their colleagues' tutorials, or they could move into the breakout room for a more informal chat amongst themselves, just as they might do in Studio. This strategy had mixed results as well. Some students would utilise this opportunity for an informal meeting, but in other tutorials, the students preferred to see their colleagues' works being tutored, and the breakout rooms stood empty for the duration of the session. Anecdotal discussion with students revealed that some were setting up their own online meetings outside of tutorial days, which might suggest the redundancy of the breakout rooms during Zoom sessions. Reflecting on the experience of teaching design online, Jamie Scott opined that the dialogic teaching afforded via webcams and screens was diminished compared to that which occurs in the shared social space of the design studio. The period from the first lockdown in March 2020 to the start of the 2021-22 academic year will equate to almost half of some students' undergraduate education. A significant number may never have worked in Studio. They will need nurturing through their enculturation into the socio-constructive processes of design studio practice. For example, whereas previously students may have been used to working alongside their peers and informally discussing their ideas with each other, these peer-to-peer interactions will be a novel experience. Initiating an informal programme of student peer reviews could be one means through which to facilitate these dialogic interactions. They could run concurrently alongside one-to-one tutorials, with students presenting their work to each other when not discussing it with their tutor. This would add an additional strand of dialogic interaction to the repertoire of socio-constructive studio learning methods. In its traditional format, the design review has faced some significant criticism. The return to Studio after a prolonged hiatus provides opportunity to rethink the format and process of this signature element of creative education. Students' enculturation into this feedback ritual could be harnessed to introduce new methods and alternative approaches. In addition to more widespread use of peer review, Webster proposes the introduction of new rituals that nurture a more supportive, collaborative, and dialogical learning environment, such as enhanced tutorials with consultants and practitioners, and student self-evaluation. Collectively, these aim to facilitate the avoidance of surface tactics sometimes seen in design reviews, and instead encourage students to present their more authentic selves. At JMU, the online teaching has facilitated some significant opportunities that otherwise would not have occurred. For example, international guest lectures have been easily arranged, significantly broadening the scope of students' learning. For dissertation students, primary research in the form of interviews has been easily facilitated, including with international architects with whom they would previously have been unlikely to meet. As such, there are some distinctly positive aspects to virtual learning, which should be retained and nurtured. This presentation raised the question of whether socio-constructivist pedagogy can function effectively in virtual spaces. For Vygotsky, learning is a profoundly social process, one in which dialogue plays a crucial role. Experience from teaching architecture at LJMU and evidence in the research literature have both shown that the social process has proved difficult to create in an online environment. One reason for this is due to the rich mixture of types of dialogue that occur in studio between different participants. When these transition to a virtual context, they revert to a single format. Furthermore, on reflection, it would seem that, like the conversations themselves, learning is rendered filtered and lacking in nuance and depth. Orr and Shreve identified dialogue as the glue that holds the art and design curriculum together and enables students to practice the critical language of their discipline. Should institutions retain elements of virtual teaching alongside face-to-face, there are significant considerations to be made in design disciplines, where socio-constructivist learning predominates. The social context exerts a significant influence over the nature of interaction and dialogue between participants. As such, students' sense of presence and belonging within a community of practice requires careful nurturing. Thank you for listening to this presentation.